for a reasonable time, but that reasonable time that those can be held open, the code says under no conditions, under no circumstances can be longer than 3 months. Okay, here's another formation problem under the Uniform Commercial Code. We have something called the Battle of the Forms. Now, this is also discussed a lot in Keating. He talks about this. This is probably the most radical change that the code makes to the common law. What we're really doing here is dumping the mirror image rule, all right? Because that's ridiculous. We talked about it before. You can have counter offers that need to be accepted at their exact terms, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and no actual contract being formed. Think about the Lonergan versus Skolnick case where they were trying to sell a piece of land. So obviously it's not a UCC transaction because it's not a sale of goods. But if it was, if they were trying to sell something that was a good, you have counteroffers going back and forth. Well, the code says, why can't we just, we know what the deal is. If you look at the terms, if you look at the situation in Lonergan, any one of us can kind of look at that factual scenario and understand exactly what was being sold, what it was being sold for. I mean, you've got all the basic terms there. So why wasn't that ever considered a contract, right? Because it's common law. But also, I mean, if you're dealing with a type of business that does transactions like that and needs to get them done quickly, then that's just a waste of time. All right, so Battle of the Forms. We're taking the mirror image rule out of effect. Battle of the Forms 2207, I should say, says that acceptance can be effective even if it states new or different terms from those in the offer. Right? So we've completely destroyed the concept of the counteroffer, or have we? We'll see how this plays out. The million-dollar question to this is, are those new terms, the new terms that are in that acceptance, do they become part of the agreement? Are the parties obligated to perform in accordance with those new terms that are in the acceptance, or do the terms of the offer govern? Well, the answer is it depends. All right, and we're back to the concept of merchants. Big difference is made here on whether both parties are merchants or whether one or none of them are merchants. All right, if both parties are not merchants, so if only one of them is or neither of the parties to this transaction are merchants, then the terms of the offer govern. All right, we're holding merchants to higher standards. So if they're both merchants, they should know what's going on and they should be conscious of what's in each other's documents. Why this is called the Battle of the Forms, and I think the Keating article talks about this, and I might even give some examples, I think, is that a lot of this stuff is done on order forms, invoices, confirmations, shipping documents, and stuff like that, and there are terms on there. If you've ever received any of that stuff, you know that there's a ton of boilerplate fine print that says all kinds of stuff, and without even signing anything, you're just agreeing to it. All right, so you can imagine when order forms that say one thing are being sent, and then in response to that, you're getting an order confirmation sheet that has a bunch more boilerplate fine print on it. They're going to conflict in a lot of places. Under common law, there's no contract. The code says we can have a contract. The bigger question is, what is the agreement? All right, so if they're not merchants, we don't hold them responsible for knowing what's changed when you get the acceptance back. Terms of the offer will govern. But when both of them are merchants, it's a different situation. The terms of the acceptance are going to govern the agreement unless, all right, so this is kind of an exception to that rule. First of all, if the terms materially alter the agreement. All right, so LL Bean calls up its supplier and says we need 150 extra large black t-shirts, and then they send back a confirmation that says we're going to send you 100 size small red t-shirts. Right? Well, obviously, if the terms materially alter the agreement like that, then the terms of the acceptance are not going to govern. In other words, LL Bean is not going to be obligated to accept 100 red size small t-shirts when what they really wanted was 150 extra large. I mean, that's just fair. That just makes sense. Two other situations. The offer expressly limits acceptance to the terms of the offer, which is, since business people are becoming more and more conscious of what's in the Uniform Commercial Code, you'll see this language in there, that this offer is, expressly limited to the terms of this offer. No additional terms will be accepted. Or if there has been some kind of negotiation, the offeror might have already objected to those terms prior to acceptance. So LL Bean contacts their t-shirt supplier and says, we need 150 black extra large t-shirts, and they say, okay, but we can't get them to you for another 3 weeks. And LL Bean says, no, I need them in 5 days. And they say, oh, okay, well, all right, we'll do the best we can. We'll get them there. And then LL Bean sends the order. They send back a confirmation, and somewhere in the fine print of that order confirmation, it says shipment will be sent 14 to 21 days after the order is received. Right? LL Bean has already objected to it being sent. That they said they needed it in 5 days. They've objected to it being 2 to 3 weeks. So they're not going to be responsible for following that. All right. So that's formation. The next step in this process is figuring out what the terms of the agreement are. A lot of times these contracts are formed without clarity in what the terms of the agreement are. So think about common law. You can't form a contract unless you know what the terms are. The offer and the acceptance must reflect the terms. Right? That was another problem in the Lonergan v. Skolnick case. Looking at the offer and looking at the acceptance, the court was hung up on trying to figure out what the terms of the contract were by dealing with that. And at one point they had to say, oh, well, the terms are reflected in a bunch of different writings. One of the parties was trying to argue that. All right? In common law, that just doesn't make sense. The code accepts that. Not only does the code accept that sometimes the terms are reflected over a number of different writings and not neatly contained in one offer and agreed to in one acceptance, they even say you don't even have to state terms. You can leave them open, and the code will provide those terms for you. We call these open terms. All right. So one of the open terms is price. So think about that in common law. You can't possibly sell something under common law rules unless you've said how much you're going to sell it for. What's the price? Right? It creates all kinds of problems in common law. The code says you don't have to agree on price. We'll provide it for you. So where the parties have not agreed, or if the contract is silent and left to be agreed later, the code will provide a term. The term, they say, is a reasonable price at the time of delivery. Well, we're stuck on reasonable. What does that mean? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But everything that we're selling, especially in goods, usually has a market value. And if you know enough about the market or about the industry or about the trade, you can sort of figure out what a reasonable price was on a certain day when the goods were going to be delivered. The time of delivery is also an important part of this. It's not when the contract was formed. It's not when the goods were being manufactured or born or picked off the tree or whatever. Because again, animals can be goods. Fruit that hasn't even blossomed yet off of a tree can be goods. So you got to think about those things. And what happens if you place an order now to an orange supplier down in Florida to buy a ton of oranges because you make orange juice, you're Tropicana, and Florida gets hit by a freak blizzard, which, given the way weather has been lately, probably isn't too far out of the ordinary, too far out of the question, and the entire orange crop in Florida gets completely decimated. Well, the price of oranges is going to skyrocket, and if you haven't set a price for your oranges at the time of the contract, the court is going to set a reasonable price at the time of delivery. So if your supplier is the only orange grove still standing in the entire state of Florida, the price of their oranges is going to skyrocket. You haven't agreed to a price, so now a reasonable price at the time of delivery is what the code says you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to pay the higher price for those oranges. Now, that scenario is, I'm thinking in my head, could also fall under a number of different code sections. There are code sections that deal with unreasonable and uncontrollable, unforeseeable changes in the situation governing a contract, and may give you an opportunity to kind of get out of it. But for the most part, if you haven't agreed to price, reasonable price at the time of delivery is what you're looking at. And I can guarantee you that's what the Orange Grove seller is going to be arguing when Tropicana tries to back out of that deal. How about another one? Payment. The terms of payment don't have to be agreed to, and a lot of times in common law they're not either, but sometimes they are. It depends, I guess, on what you're selling. But if you haven't agreed to payment, payment is due at time and place of buyer's receipt of goods. Now the reason why they put this in there is just to let all the sellers know you're not going to get paid ahead of time. All right, you're not going to be paid for goods ahead of when you've actually delivered them to the buyer, unless you agree otherwise. Remember, these are open terms, so you can agree to different payment terms, you can agree to different price terms, right? So it's kind of giving notice to the sellers. If you want to be paid ahead of time, or partially ahead of time and partially at the time of delivery, you need to make that part of the agreement. Delivery. We're going to come back to this a little bit later, but it's important to note now, if you haven't agreed to terms of delivery, they need to be made in a single lot, not in portions or periodic shipments, in one single delivery, and they are to be delivered at the seller's place of business, not residence. That is not a typo, all right? You think of delivery, you think of Domino's Pizza, where you order it, they show up at your house, you're the buyer, and they give it to you. That's really nice and convenient for you. But the code says, if you haven't agreed otherwise, they are delivered at the seller's place of business. That's kind of letting buyers know, hey, if you haven't agreed otherwise, it's going to be your responsibility to go to the seller's place of business and take possession of whatever it is that you've purchased. Or residence, if the seller doesn't have a place of business. It doesn't say merchant there, it says seller. All right? This applies to all sellers, so that's why we have to put or residence. It may not be somebody who deals in goods of a kind or somebody who's a dealer at all. So when we talk about delivery, we'll get to that a little bit later. I think it's part 5 of this lecture. When we get there, you will see how that can be changed and why that's important. All right. Oh, I forgot. We have an unless. All right. If the goods are already at another location and both parties are aware of that, then they have to be picked up. Oops. They have to be picked up at that location. What am I talking about? Well, I kind of already mentioned this. If you're a t-shirt manufacturer, and I just keep coming back to this, I don't know why, but it makes for a good example, and you're cranking out red, blue, black, gray, white t-shirts on a daily basis, you're not dealing with oranges, you're not dealing with lobsters, you're not dealing with things that are going to perish and go bad. So you don't have to be all that concerned about storing them for long periods of time. You can just take those t-shirts, wrap them up in plastic so they don't get mildewy, and store them somewhere. Right? That's what warehousing is for. And the code has a section that deals with warehousing and the laws of the rules of warehousing. That's what a lot of manufacturers do. So if you're LLB and you're contacting the manufacturer of t-shirts and you're placing an order, chances are they have a bunch of t-shirts already made that fit your order, and they are not on site. They're in a warehouse somewhere, probably far, far away. A lot of manufacturers will keep warehousing locations close to centers of distribution. Places like Memphis. Memphis is a major hub for distribution, mostly because FedEx is there, but because FedEx that's like FedEx's home hub. A lot of other distribution companies have kind of gone there because that's where the business of distribution is going. So there's a lot of warehousing that goes on right around Memphis and in northern Mississippi because there's a lot of land, and they can just set up big warehouses and hold on to goods so that when the order comes in for such and such a number of t-shirts, the manufacturer contacts the warehousers and says, all right, send these products, these goods to this location, and all the warehouse, it goes right out from the warehouse out to the buyer. Warehousing is big business, actually. So anyway, goods in another location. If both parties are aware that they're at another location, then they are going to be delivered at that location, right? So unless you've agreed otherwise, buyer is going to have to be responsible for taking delivery of those goods at the warehouse or wherever location they're being stored. Okay. Supplementing the terms. This is another really interesting thing about the Uniform Commercial Code. Under common law, when it comes down to